folks, welcome, and I hope you can hear us all. I think this is a very important panel because it was a French philosopher who once said, "You are what you eat." And for, I think, far too long, we've taken for granted what we eat, how much food we have, how we grow it, who's hungry, and how we deal with those issues. So the subject is how we will feed 9 billion people. It's actually about 9.5 billion people. And I want to give you a few facts so you can understand this. There are 1.4 billion people in this world who live on less than $1.25 a day. Most hunger in this world, whether it's in the United States or worldwide, is associated with poverty, and we have folks who can talk about that today. The population growth is expected to go from 7 billion to 9.587 billion in the year 2050, and most of that will be in low-income countries. The developing world is not seeing much population growth. There's also big economic growth, huge growth in food consumption in places like China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Brazil. And the middle class outside the United States is expected to double by the year 2020, and world food demand is expected to double by the year 2050. That is, we must produce twice as much food in 2050 than we do today, with limited land, limited water, and all sorts of environmental and climate impacts. So I give you these facts because this is an enormous problem, and it is one that impacts every one of us, and it impacts the political stability around the world, and it impacts our humanitarian obligations as well. So the real questions is, how do we deal with this? What are the impediments, and what are the opportunities? And we have 4 great panelists with us. We have Lauren Bush, is the CEO of Feed Projects. You can see all of their bios in the information, but she serves as chairman of Feed. She is an honorary spokesperson for the World Food Program, which is the agency of the United Nations that provides virtually all the food to hungry people around the world. The United States has traditionally supplied about half the food to the World Food Program that we have used, and all of you know her background in the fashion world and other places, which I would talk about if you'd let me, but I think you probably want me to go on and talk about something else. The next is my friend Tom Daschle. Everybody here knows him. Many of you just heard him talk about the healthcare situation. He is the senior policy advisor at DLA Piper and a member of their global board. Most of you know him. He was a former United States senator, a Democratic leader, served in the House with me, is on various organizations, one of the most distinguished public servants of our time by far. And I think that, and he comes from a rural state, but he has a very strong global view of policy issues. He's been involved in this issue as well. Helene Gayle is president and CEO of CARE USA, one of the largest NGOs and humanitarian organizations in the world. She's been at the Centers for Disease Control, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She serves on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, and she is somebody who can talk about what one of the largest NGOs in the world is doing on the ground, especially overseas. And finally, Beth Sauerhaft. I got Beth right this time, right? Beth Sauerhaft. Beth is Director of Global Environmental Sustainability for PepsiCo and works in their Global Health and Agriculture divisions. She's worked at the EPA. She has a great history working at the Department of Agriculture as well, I might say. When I was there, she was one of the best employees I had because, but in any event, the role of the private sector is becoming increasingly critical in feeding the world in the future. So I think I'm going to start with Lauren and talk a little bit about what Feed is doing to address the problems and what do you think are some of the real opportunities, both domestically and internationally, to deal with this issue of global hunger?
Sure. So Feed started 5 years ago, and it started when I was a student. I had the opportunity to travel with the World Food Program and learn about the issues of hunger and poverty firsthand. And obviously the disparity after you see it, and you come back to America and you walk into a grocery store, you're like, wow, it's just mind-blowing. And so I started Feed. I had the idea for the initial feed bag. Now everyone here has a feed bag, which is very exciting to me. And every bag sold feeds a child in school for a year. So I wanted a way to make world hunger very tangible. And the program we've supported most to date is school feeding abroad. World Food Program in 62 of the poorest countries around the world is essentially giving a free school meal to kids, and it's enough for them to attend school. It's incentivizing their parents to send them to school, and it's proven, obviously, when girls are educated, you know, maybe as a result of this school meal, they'll have less children, they'll get married later in life, the children they do have will be better educated. So I really fell in love with the school feeding program because it's a wonderful development program, and it's really helping kids hopefully break out of the poverty cycle they're born into. And as well, it's packed with nutrients such as vitamin A and zinc and all the important things they need. So that's the main program FEED has supported thus far, but we look to support many other programs, vitamin A, micronutrient powder. There's a lot of neat innovations happening, Purchase for Progress out there, you know, sustainable agriculture. And I just hope FEED is sort of a conduit for others, individuals, especially young people, to want to get involved and to be able to get involved in world hunger in a very tangible and hopefully meaningful way.
You know, I just say that to some extent what we tried to replicate around the world in school feeding was started here in the United States. Mm-hmm. It's one of the most successful social programs in the history of America is our school meals program. And to some extent, others are now trying to model and adopt that. And so what you're doing is really important. Helene, you run one of the largest NGOs in the world. You're in how many countries around the world?
Oh, about 87.
87. So what are you seeing as the biggest impediments to these problems now and the biggest opportunities?
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, when it comes to feeding the planet, there are several impediments, or several pressures. We talked about it a lot this morning in the session on population. Clearly, population pressure is a big one. And the places where food insecurity is a big problem are also the places where the population is growing most rapidly, most notably sub-Saharan Africa. Climate change is having a huge impact on our ability to feed the planet. You know, whether it is in some places more frequent droughts leading to famine and lack of food, like what we're seeing now in the Sahel, where 18 million people are potentially at risk for starvation. And, you know, in that area of the world, that cycle used to be every few decades. It's now, this is the third such cycle in 7 years, and so that's happening more rapidly. Or the other extreme, places like Bangladesh, where more frequent cyclones and flooding are wiping out crops. So, you know, the whole effect of climate change is another one. And, you know, then I think, you know, there are huge missed opportunities. Lauren mentioned it, you know, the role of women in agriculture and the fact that in poor countries, women, especially smallholder farmers, are responsible for more than 50% of cultivation of agriculture, but own less than 1% of farmland and get less than 10% of the credits for agriculture, and on and on. And so, you know, there's a real missed opportunity, and maybe we'll come back to that. So, you know, I think we're seeing that, you know, there is a real challenge there. Again, back to the situation of the Sahel, you know, this is a part of the world that many people don't even know. You know, when I say the Sahel, it doesn't even mean much to people. You know, we're talking about small West African countries that have in many people's minds been forgotten. But the long-term impact of what a malnourished child, and there's, you know, it's predicted that maybe 1 million children risk being malnourished, the long-term impact on that child's development, and it goes back to the school feeding program. It's why it was such a big boost for us, is that children who have adequate nutrition go to school, they learn, they can become productive adults. So, you know, malnutrition has a huge impact that's way beyond whether children go to bed hungry at night. And so, you know, I think those are some of the challenges and some of the problems. On the flip side, you know, it's really incredible, and I'm sure Tom will talk about it more, that, you know, on a policy front, we are putting more into agriculture in poor communities than we have in decades. We had a very, very strong culture of focus on agriculture from the U.S. government that really has been eroded over the last few decades, and that's being revitalized and and our giving and our focus on that is improving, and I think that's a huge opportunity. And just finally, I think the area of innovation in agriculture is also something where I think there's a lot of attention being paid, whether it's to drought-resistant seeds, where there's huge innovation going on, or flood moisture-resistant seeds, or new drip irrigation systems that are much less expensive and more suited to developing country circumstances. So there is a huge body of innovation that's going on that does, I think, offer us some real opportunities. But it means that we've got to put that kind of focus on agriculture along with all the rest of the strategies that help
So if
lead
you
to
were
food
to
security.
say what's the most important thing we should do as a country in this regard, the U.S., to deal with these issues, what would it be, do you think?
There's never one, but I think it is prioritizing agriculture in the developing world as a huge priority, and that means resources, it means the right policies, and it means a sustained focus on it, and not what we often do, which is to say this is the issue of the day and then move on to something else. It is going to take at least a decade of solid focus in this area, but I think the benefits will be huge. They'll be huge not only in terms of food security, adequate nutrition, but economic growth. Agriculture will be the economic engine for much of the parts of the world that we're most concerned about in terms of overall global poverty.
There's three statistics I want to tell you. Between 1980 and 2005, foreign aid to the less developed countries in the world for agriculture development dropped from $8 billion to $3.4 billion per year, from 17% to 3% of the total. In the 1980s, 25% of U.S. foreign aid went to agriculture. That dropped to 6% by 1990 and 1% last year. And the share of World Bank lending going to agriculture fell from 30% in 1978 to 16% in 1988 to 8% in 2006. So this, for so long, has been a low priority. And Tom, you spent all these years in Congress dealing with these issues, and now you've traveled to Africa, you've been around the world. Here we have, as a society, we have debt, we have our budget problems. It used to be the United States was a big contributor both in food aid as well as although not as good in foreign assistance. So as you look at this situation, what do you think our country needs to be doing?
Well, Dan, I guess I'd start by saying that I think we've got to make it more relevant to most people in our country today. It isn't that relevant, and there is this perception that assistance, whatever we provide, constitutes 20 or 30% of our budget, which couldn't be farther from the truth. It's less than 1% totally. And I think one way to make it relevant is, I come from a smaller state. South Dakota has about 750,000 people. Our second largest city is Rapid City, South Dakota, with about 50,000 people. 50,000 people every single day die because of hunger. 50,000, 21,000 children, which happens to be the third largest city in South Dakota, my hometown of Aberdeen. So we lose that many people, not in a year or a month, but in a day. And I think that fact just really has to be emphasized and repeated over and over. And once we get their attention, then we have to say, look, you may not fully appreciate this, but if we're going to feed the world in the next 40 years, we have to produce more food in 40 years than we did in the last 8,000. You heard me right. More food in the next 40 years than in the last 8,000. And so we're going to have to do three things a lot better than we've done so far. We have to produce more food and more nutritious food, to Helene's point. We've got to make drought-resistant crops more nutritious and nutritious crops more drought-resistant. That's the first step. Secondly, we've got to make it more accessible and more affordable. The fact is that most people in the world in developing countries live on less than $2 a day. 1 billion people live on $1 a day, and Helene can give us all the statistics on that, and Lauren too. But that's the second thing. It's got to be affordable and it's got to be accessible. And the third thing we have to do is to understand we are living in a world that demands sustainability. especially with regard to water resources and land resources. 70% of the people are moving to urban areas, which means that we're going to have extraordinary challenges in distributing the food in addition to proper sustainable practices. So those are the three public policy challenges that aren't going to go away and are only going to get worse if we don't address them soon.
Okay, Beth, so you're with a company, I see PepsiCo around town here and offering its beverages for free. I hope you will do this nationwide. But tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what the private sector is doing, and especially in the area of helping people develop their own agriculture and their own food production.
Okay, so thanks. As many of you know, PepsiCo is a large global food and beverage company. We operate or manufacture in 200 countries around the world. And we are focusing on developing that right recipe to feed the next billion. We're doing it through applying a model of doing more and using less throughout the entire supply chain. And we're also doing it, basing it on sort of a sustainable farming initiative. Every product that we make relies on agricultural raw materials. In fact, 6 out of the 10 highest items that we procure are agricultural materials. So some of the things that we're doing touch on things that each of you has said. For example, we have a project with smallholder farmers in Mexico where we are working with about 600 farmers to grow sunflowers. And the plan is for our Mexico business to use these sunflowers and process them into heart-healthy sunflower oil. So that goes to the nutrition part of what people have been saying. And it's also working with these smallholder farmers. We've committed to a 7-year contracts with the farmers. We've partnered with the Inter-American Development Bank, and we've also partnered with a local financing organization. And so when the farmers have that kind of a long-term contract with us, the banks view them as much less of a risk. So they're able to access capital through the banks. And with that capital, they can buy the inputs that they need to grow the sunflowers, whether it's seed or fertilizer or agrochemicals or other technologies. And so what we're seeing is a real win-win-win sort of situation. We, of course, are getting the raw material that we need, a healthier product. The farmers are, have a long-term contract with us, so they're doing better. And they're gaining a lot of skills, agronomic skills, in how to produce these crops from the partnership with us and the financing institutions. And any skill that any farmer that we work with, and we work with quite a few growers through direct contracts, they can, of course, apply to the crops that they grow on the rotation. So it's not like we're just focusing it to the crop that they're growing for us. It has a much big expansive effect.
Helene?
Yeah, and I was just going to comment on that. We're not working directly with PepsiCo yet, but we are working with several other companies where, I think that the power that business has to really be part of the solution is huge, because the large multinational corporations are the only ones who have the kind of scale and reach that can really make a big difference, both in terms of helping to improve agricultural outputs, but also in terms of helping to develop communities' own economic development. And so, in a lot of the areas that we're in, as an example, we're working with Walmart with cashew growing women in India. And these are women who are really at the bottom rung, smallholder farmers who are getting the skills to increase their cashew yield. They're getting a fair price for their cashews. Those cashews are now being sold back to Walmart and becoming part of their international value chain. And it is one of those win-win situations that I think we're seeing more and more. So, part of why I can feel somewhat optimistic about where we're going in this whole area is that they're new partners. And there is a renewed emphasis. And I think that greater partnership is going to get us much further than when we were trying to do it alone and when it was only a government responsibility. I think we now have the government private sector, NGO sector, communities working together. And so I do think that we're making some headway, but it will only continue if we continue to keep the kind of resources and the kind of political will and the ownership of the countries themselves. And coming out of the most recent G8, I think the focus that was given on agriculture with the African heads of state who have all said we are going to make agricultural productivity one of our highest priorities is also part of it, because it has to be countries taking that kind of ownership themselves as well.
Tom, you want to make a comment?
I was just going to say to both Beth and Helene's point that the other aspect of public-private partnerships that becomes so critical is that every government today is dealing with huge budgetary pressures, and there is a significant likelihood that federal funding, government funding in not only the United States but around the world is going to be under great pressure. And that just begs these public-private partnership arrangements, because we're going to have to make up in resources what may not be available in tax revenue. And so it's all the more important that we do that. But if we're going to do it, I hope we can loosen up the regulatory framework within which these public-private partnerships can evolve, because right now they're so constrained that they produce a lot of unnecessary impediments.
Is that from the U.S. government?
Well, the U.S. government in particular.
Yeah.
We have a lot of issues that prevent real interaction and real interface between public and private entities that I think will be addressed over time out of necessity, but they exist today in ways that I think are very counterproductive.
And some of the trade regulations more globally also add to this, because there is probably enough food right now in the world to feed people, but it's maldistributed. And part of that is because it is so tough to get the kind of distribution so that the food gets to the places that it needs. And some of that has to do with some of our trade regulations as well.
I'm told that we lose overseas about 30% of the food to waste, storage loss. In fact, it's interesting, in the United States, we throw away 95 billion pounds of food into the garbage every year. Have you seen any of the evidence of waste and maybe things we can do with that particular thing as you've been there?
I mean, I have seen some progress being made in that NGOs are going in, like the World Food Program, and investing in things such as food dryers, so they can dry the grain or corn that can then be stored longer. So I think it's just something we all need to kind of commit to doing, whether it's on a government level, on a private sector level, and on the NGO level, to really say, okay, we know a lot of waste is happening. What facilities can we put into place on the ground that are going to prevent that?
Lauren's exactly right. You've got to have a real commitment to new infrastructure, storage, drying products, but also roads. A lot of people can't get their crops to market simply because the roads are so bad. And in a lot of the developing world, that is by far the biggest impediment. But you're right too, Dan, in this country, we ought to come up with much more innovative ways to save food that would allow us, if not to distribute it elsewhere, at least to use it more efficiently here.
I think that's why it's so important that the private sector is involved, because with a development project that's done in isolation to help farmers grow a crop or increase yields in the crop, okay, they've got a bountiful yield, but where's it going to go? And so with the private sector involved, there's a market, and they're going to deliver the product to the customer. And that's why it's really important that we're working on this whole supply chain in partnership.
So let me ask you this. Historically, the United States has been a very significant distributor of surplus food to people to keep folks from starving to death. And we still do that. And I think America will always provide that role. But it seems that at least some of the effort is shifting to building self-sufficiency around the world so they can grow it themselves, which is a good idea. But how would you articulate this to, let's say, a congressman or a policymaker, why we should be spending all these resources to help overseas folks when, in fact, we have 45 million people on food stamps right now, and we have some of those difficult economic situations inside America? I mean, how do you argue for America's role in the world in terms of what the public and private sectors are doing, given the economic and fiscal conditions we have? How do you make that argument?
I mean, I think both are obviously necessary. I can speak in my own personal experience when I started Feed, helping Africa, and this was pre-recession, and helping the poor countries around the world was more focused. And now a lot of the companies we do business with say, we get that that's a problem. There's less of a safety net there. It's a different type of hunger. But we see hunger in our backyards, and we want to support hungry Americans here. And there is such food insecurity here. It's a different type of food insecurity. It's a shame people can more easily go to McDonald's and have, a meal that will fill them up rather than going to the grocery store and getting filled up on healthy produce. So I think it's a whole, it's a very different issue. But hunger is hunger, and malnutrition is malnutrition. It just takes on a different form in America and in countries that are more developed. But I think it's equally important, but it's perhaps, like the Sahel region, it's an emergency. And from a security perspective, a hungry person is an angry person, and is a unstable person, is a vulnerable person. If you cannot feed yourself, cannot feed your family, you are not in a good state. Your country, your community is not in a good state. And so I do think it's our obligation as a country that has more resources to help those who have less.
Tom?
Well, I think Lauren really just nailed it. I would say there's three messaging components. Obviously, there's a humanitarian message here. We can't be the richest country in the world and not be concerned about the way we distribute resources and figure out ways to help the less fortunate. So that humanitarian message is a very compelling one. The second is, I think the one that Lauren just mentioned, security. These are troubled times. Look at Afghanistan, you look at Sudan, you look at Somalia, you could go on and on. The list continues to get longer. But those troubled spots all over the world pose real threats. They could be Al-Qaeda sources, they could be sources that extend turmoil in the region. I mean, there is a legitimate security argument to make that it's in our interest, our own self-interest, to help ensure that these insecure areas, these troubled, volatile areas can be addressed. But then there's also a third one, and I think it would be, I'd call it my competitive argument. China's doing some of this. They're out there because they think that there are real markets to be made in these areas over time. So it's not only humanitarian security, but there's also a commercial element to this that provides opportunities for new business if we could stabilize and enhance the economic vitality in these regions.
Helene, you're on the ground doing this all the time, and you're probably lobbying on the Hill all the time, right?
The same three arguments all the time. It's economic, it's security, and it's humanitarian. And I always try thinking, I've got to convince people of the security and the economic one. That's in people's self-interest. That's the one that will sell the day. And it is always the humanitarian one that really, really is where it hits people most. Because I think it's where it hits people at their heart and at their core and at their sense of values. And it goes back to your original point about, the cities in I started to say Iowa, South Dakota, people being able to visually understand what that means to have a whole city that they know wiped out. So, I think at the end of the day, Americans are generous people. Americans are people who want to live their values, and are people who want to show that they can rise to this more noble sense of goodness in the world. And I also make the argument that you either pay now or you pay later. And time again, we see, and your points about what we invested in agriculture before and now is a good point. If we play this on the cheap, we suffer the consequences later. So you pay now or you pay later. And again, back to what you said about the people's notion of what we contribute for foreign assistance. Yes, if you ask people, they think we give 20 to 25% of our gross national product to foreign assistance. But if you ask people, what would you think is the right number, they say about 10%. And we give less than 1%. So there is a gap there between what the American public is actually willing to do and what we do. So I argue that our Congress is actually far behind where the will of the American people is. I'm not arguing 10%, I'm just arguing, you know, could we do a full 1%? Could we do 5%? You know, could we, even if we went to something like 2%, that would be huge. But it's somewhere between where we are and where the people actually think we should be that would really allow us to have a huge impact on this problem and, the greater problems.
Yeah, I would agree with what all of you have said, and I think it really does present an economic opportunity, whether it's for American companies to be expanding, business overseas with any help that U.S. government may give. It's technology development. There's a number of things that we've developed, whether it's in the U.S. or in the U.K. or wherever around the world, different technologies that we've developed that are helping our growers increase their yields and use resources more widely. I also think there's a whole research component to it and a capacity building component to it. We have a fabulous university system in this country, and why not take advantage of it and help with capacity building around the world where those universities aren't built up to the same extent that they are. And then those people in turn will then, after the universities are built up, students attend the universities, they have the skills maybe to produce food, but also to come and work for multinational companies or local corporations.
Okay, so now we'll open it up to any questions or comments, and I just ask you to raise your hand, and I'm going to start with Peggy right here. So because she was so nice to me, I got to return the favor. All right.
Thank you. What a great panel. Are we doing enough, fast enough, and at large enough scale? You just talked about the Sahel. In Somalia, Somalia has the 8th highest family size in the world. Women were walking with their children for days and deciding which children to leave behind because they were not able to feed them. So how do other factors, health, population, economy, politics, play into this? And even with the glorious pronouncements at the G8 summit, you guys are on the ground, you guys have been working on this for years. Is it enough?
Any?
Well, clearly it's not enough. And there are lots of factors. I mean, you mentioned Somalia. One of the factors that we haven't talked about is governance, and a good government has a huge amount to do with whether or not its people get fed. And in a country like Somalia that doesn't have a stable or existing government, it's not surprising that the very same conditions are exacerbated. So, I think issues like that are critical. There's a whole range, whether it is population, which we talked about before, that has an impact. The role of women, which again I think has a huge impact. The Food and Agriculture Organization, the other UN food agency, estimated that if we close the gap between some of the things I said before, the fact that women don't own farmland, don't get food credit for agricultural inputs, et cetera, don't get decision making in the farming, but yet are responsible for most of the smallholder farmer production. If we were just to close some of those gaps, it would feed 150 million more people instantly. So there are things like that we don't take advantage of. So yeah, there's a lot more that could be done, but I am encouraged that we're moving in the right direction, but we're not doing enough fast enough. And I think that some of the statistics about what's going on in terms of climate change, what's going on in terms of population, the increase of the middle class, which means there's going to be more food consumption. All of those factors means that we really are up against a time bomb in terms of there to feed the population.
Tom?
I would just say, Peggy, that we aren't even close to where we need to be, and but there are a lot more efforts underway, and I would only cite one that I'm very excited about, In fact, it's not even public yet, but I guess I'm allowed to talk about it.
Nobody here will say anything.
That's right. But it'll be released on July 10th. But one company with whom I work, DuPont, is working with the Economist Intelligence Unit to come up with something called a Global Food Security Index. It's going to take 25 of the factors that Helene mentioned in every country, well, in 105 countries, and measure each one of those 25 components in each one of the 105 companies and come up with an index. And you'll be able to online tweak any one of those factors to say, okay, what if we changed governance? Or what if we changed infrastructure? What if we changed the role of women and specify how we would do it? And it would improve or change in some way the index itself. And it's going to rank these countries by their indices and give us yet another comparative tool that allow us to figure out what would be the most effective thing we can do, because it really doesn't apply that the same thing works in every country.
Right.
Every country is different, and we have to figure out what the index will be for that particular country in order to address the challenges in that country.
I think there's a question over here. This gentleman with the same color hair as I've got, white hair. And, yeah.
Thank you. Jonathan Halpern with Designing Sustainability. The Farm Bill. That's the shorthand for the question, right? But the question is that the Farm Bill is, give or take, $300 billion. U.S. economic assistance is maybe a tenth of that. The domestic policy that we have here in terms of agriculture and food has an enormous impact around the world in terms of how the prices affect farmers in the developing world. Comments, thoughts about what do we do about the Farm Bill such that it has positive rather than negative impact globally?
Tom, you want to? Sorry, but
Dan can probably do a much better job as the former Secretary of Agriculture, but I'll give it a shot. I served on the committees like he did. In fact, we were seatmates for a long time, but I think your point is so well taken. We have to change the way we look at agricultural subsidies in particular. I'm very pleased that they made a contribution in that regard this time. They took out the direct payments. And your question, of course, is very timely because the Congress is finishing up the Farm Bill. At least they finished it on the Senate side. It's now going to the House. But clearly, our own policies have undermined our ability to be more effectively engaged in the developing world today. But as Dan said, it's also the Farm Bill that provides for school lunch and a lot of the programs that are extraordinarily helpful. So it's, there are good components and ones that are in need of revision. I think we're making some progress, but we have a lot farther we can go.
Just on that one, just a little bit too, I think there were some provisions in the Farm Bill that really did move forward, particularly in terms of the ability to spend money for regional and local purchase, which is something we've been advocating for a long time, not just shipping food, American food over for emergencies. So there's, I think, up to $40 million a year can be spent now on local and regional purchase, which will help to stimulate agriculture in the areas in which food is needed. There's a provision that focuses on having much greater efficiency in monetization, which is a policy we've been trying to phase out of. Not phasing out of it, but at least it's applying a standard that really says if you're going to use monetization of food, then it has to actually have a certain efficiency level. Also a provision that incentivizes NGOs that have been relying on crops as a source of money to actually be able to get direct cash instead for non-food items. And there are a couple of others that really do go a long way towards looking at the international needs very differently than the Farm Bill did in the past. And we hope that the House will also include some of those provisions.
I concur. I just want to make one other point. For generations, farmers have been strong supporters of food assistance around the world. Why? Because it provided an outlet for surpluses. The danger now is we're not going to have a lot of surpluses anymore just because of supply and demand being much more in equilibrium for all the reasons that we've talked about. So the trick is to continue to build political support for helping countries become self-sufficient and providing humanitarian assistance when it's desperately needed. And that's going to be a greater challenge than I think it used to be, in my own judgment. Let's see, this gentleman right there.
Hi there, Jay Winston from the Harvard School of Public Health. There have been a number of comments made by the panel about the important messages that need to be disseminated to the public. But I guess my question is, in the brave new world of digital and social media, with the incredible fragmentation of the media marketplace, with the very short attention span that people have today, how do we break through, and not only break through in a clever way for a month, but break through for a sustained period of time that's needed to build political support and political will? And remember earlier this year when a West Coast NGO put together a campaign aimed at a single Ugandan warlord and attempting to put pressure on his activities through the American government. And more than 100 million young people embraced the project for a week, only for a week. So I guess my question is, you all are talking about how you lobby Capitol Hill. I'm not sure that that's the right group of people to be talking to right now. They have to first hear from the public. And I'm wondering whether young people in particular, I mean, at Harvard, there are 800 undergraduates each year signing up for a global health course. And there are similar courses with hundreds and hundreds of students signing up across the country. Is there an opportunity to mobilize a Pepsi generation? That is, young people, before they're raising kids, when they're free to care about others, to try to create political pressure for change.
There's only one person on this panel eligible to answer for young people.
Well, Lauren?
Thank you for that question.
Although the rest of you are pretty young.
No.
But, yeah.
No, I started Feed out of a frustration of exactly what you said. I feel there's an apathy out there because world hunger is so big and it's so massive. You know, you immediately turn off and you're bombarded every 5 seconds on Twitter and Facebook with this cause and that cause and this news story and that news story. And how do you let people engage in world hunger, especially young people, you know, who can't write a big check to CARE yet, who may not want to go join the Peace Corps and may not want to join the World Food Program in the field? And how do you keep them engaged and keep them wanting to do more? And the good news about hunger is there's a solution. It's food, it's nutrition. It's not, you know, it's not rocket science. We need new innovation, we need new thinkers, but we know how to solve this. So what I aim to do with Feed is exactly that: turn, you know, young people into activists, into donors through selling. Mainly, we started through selling products. So we've been able to give nearly 60 million school meals to kids around the world, but that's through 500,000 products we've sold, which have a tangible donation built into them. So people, you know, young people, old people, anyone can really, you know, engage and feel and know that they're doing something. It's not just going into this big bank account of a big NGO. You're really very tangible. So I think more of it's needed. I would encourage people to join Feed and young people. I talked to a bunch of cool young people here I see on the second row today. So I want to create future feeders and people who really engage, because this issue is only going to get more difficult and more dire. And it needs new energy and new ideas and young people to really dig in. So I'm excited to be a part of that, and I'm constantly inspired by young people. On a very quick side note, I met this really cool girl graduating from Harvard. She invented a thing called fresh paper. And what it is, it's a natural paper, but if it's in the vicinity of fresh food, it keeps them fresh 2 to 3 times longer. So think about, and that's just come to market. So the implications of these new innovations coming from young people are incredible. And think of the, you know, we could have fresh paper and distribute it throughout Africa. It's going to do amazing things for us. So I'm very hopeful and very excited, but it needs much more to be done.
Okay, let's see, this gentleman right there, without hair.
The gentleman without hair is Olaro. Thank you for a very good discussion and for very good insights.
Can you state your name and where you're from, if you don't mind?
Olaro Tunu,
Yeah.
New York and Uganda.
Okay.
Now, I happen to think that the problem you're discussing this morning can be brought under some measure of control. And that part of the solution lies in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. Because in these two parts of the world, there is still significant arable agricultural land of high quality. And this land, for the most part, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, belongs precisely to the poor, hungry communities. There are three things that are missing. One, they need some capital to develop the land, whether through grant programs, investments, private companies, but they need some capital to inject to develop their program. Two, modern methods of agriculture, machinery, not the old-fashioned way of doing it. And three, examples which have worked well in other parts of the world adapted to their situation. Huh? That's what they need. Now, the other thing which they need, which is very important, some of the local elite are now targeting precisely these expanses of land to confiscate, so that those who are poor and hungry and have one asset, the land, will now be absolutely poor and hungry without any land at all. So the international community, the US in the first place, can help these local communities to preserve their land while developing it for their benefit. Huh?
Okay.
So those
Any
are
comments?
just,
Good, thank you very much.
Right on target.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying. And that's, I guess, one of the reasons that PepsiCo has been participating in the World Economic Forum's New Vision for Agriculture, which really talks about how can we bring public-private partnerships to bear on this food security issue, from both an amount of food as well as nutritional content of the food, while being environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable. And traditionally, going into places like sub-Saharan Africa for a large company has presented a lot of risk. But what's wonderful with this new vision is we have governments, like whether it's in Tanzania or Kenya or Ethiopia, who are saying, we want you to come in. We acknowledge that it's very critical that we develop our agricultural sector. A lot of the conversation focuses on small scale, small landholders. And so we can all go in together. So you can have a fertilizer coming in at the same time as there might be a PepsiCo coming in and an agrochemical company. And we come in together, we work with the local growers and working with NGOs and with government. And it's really got it's a beautiful equation, hopefully, for success. And I would also add, if one of the things you said, modern equipment, I think one of the challenges, if one were to make a plea or a challenge to our public industry, our private industry folks out there, precision agriculture that will work on small pieces of land. We're not talking about these huge GPS-driven combines that you see in the Midwest, but what's some sort of affordable precision ag tools that can be used on a hectare or half a hectare of land?
I think too, I would add, I mean, the fair trade movement brought it so far and into the public sphere, but really the key, what you're saying, is to make sure the benefits do get back to the local farmer. And that's up to everyone to make sure that that's the case and that there's transparency throughout. And, you know, it's great and wonderful and needed that big business is going to go into places like Africa and work with local farmers, but just to make sure that those local farmers are truly seeing the benefit, and the end result really helps them grow and thrive and scale their business as well.
I would just say that, to their credit, this administration has made this a very high priority. Secretary Clinton, the administrator of AID, Raj Shah, they've created a program called Feed the Future, which is built on exactly what you're talking about. Suitable development of agricultural practices that are suitable for the local community and providing the kinds of reforms that can build self-sufficiency. The trick is whether we put the resources in to actually get this done. But they have made a quantum leap, I think, over the last 3 years in this area.
Yeah.
Let's see, there's a gentleman right there with sunglasses. Lady, I'm sorry, excuse me. why I'm not in politics any longer.
Thank you for the opportunity to visit. I have the privilege of being a Bezos family scholar. And I come from a state, Texas, which has a tremendous amount of obesity. So Mr. Daschle, you made a comment earlier about relevancy. And I'm asking y'all to help me understand something, which is, on one hand, where I live and where I work, there are people who are completely disenfranchised from politics. And the obesity goes along with that. They don't understand anybody outside of their community, outside of their neighborhood, let alone these fantastic issues that we have the privilege of talking about today. So help me to understand, on one hand, we have a domestic problem in my community with tremendous obesity. It's a huge problem, and Texas is at the top of the problem. And on the other hand, I can completely empathize, as many people can, with the problems in third world countries. So help me to understand, to take back to my students who are coming from those communities of tremendous local need, why they should find relevance. And it's consistent with the question that was asked earlier. And I'm interested in what your thoughts are, to reach down to that lowest common denominator in my community and say, why is this relevant to you?
I think all the
Thank
folks
you.
may be interested in answering that, but I'll call on Tom first.
Well, first of all, I think we have to teach more responsibility in school. I think it starts there. I mean, responsibility in terms of our own bodies and nutrition, responsibility with regard to our debt to society. You know, that has to start with newer generations. I think generations like mine are probably a little bit beyond redemption, but I do think it has to start there. And then we've got to come back again to what are their values, and how do we coincide with those values in a way they understand. Texas is known for a pretty high church-going attendance, and I think that the humanitarian and evangelical side of all of this may be one way to connect with the values of Texans in your community. But somehow, I don't think there's one solution. I think there's got to be ways with which to reach out. But it certainly starts in the schools teaching more responsibility for our own health and for the health and well-being of people around the world.
Helene?
Yeah, and in addition, you know, I think some of the same issues around obesity in this country in some ways are also linked to malnutrition in poor countries, because obesity is also a form of malnutrition. It's the other end of the spectrum, but poverty is oftentimes a link with the obesity that we have in this country. I mean, there are people who have lots of money and just, you know, don't pay attention to what they know is are better ways of living. But there are a lot of people who, because of their own environmental circumstances, aren't able, you know, they don't have grocery stores with fresh vegetables readily available. They don't have the ability to jog in their neighborhoods because it's not safe. They don't have the ability to have a gym membership, you know, and on, and the kinds of things that are linked to not having the social economic wherewithal. And so some of the same sorts of issues for poor communities in our country are, in fact, you know, some of the same sort of issues that are the other spectrum of malnutrition, not enough food. It's the wrong kind of food, and it's still malnutrition. And so I think you can make some of those links, but some of the solutions are also the same. You know, it is very controversial what Mayor Bloomberg just did around the beverage industry and you know, the not selling supersized drinks and sugary drinks. But I think that the beverage industry has responded by trying to be as responsible about giving a range of choices. There's probably more that can be done, but I think, you know, our private sector that serves us up the options have a role to play, along with whatever one might think is the right balance between government regulation and providing options, and then looking at some of the other solutions that are around what are the environment in which people also form those behaviors. And as you know, Tom said, core to that, our schools have a huge role to play in teaching good nutrition, good health, and helping parents to be able to do that too. So,
Okay, let's see. Well, we got this young lady here, and then I'll get you, assuming we have time. We have to be out in about 5 minutes, so if we try to...
Hi, my name is Dory Macmillan, and I'm a 2012 Bezos Scholar. This has been touched on by a couple of different people, but I just wanted to know, you know, when everything was happening with Coney 2012, everyone on Facebook got really involved by way of they made their profile picture something significant, but that was not anything that had any real lasting effect and helped anyone else. And, you know, as important as it is to spread awareness, I would just ask, like, what are ways that students and young people, you know, the new generation, can create some sort of sustainable impact? Like, what can we do so that we're helping people not just by raising money, but by teaching them or doing something that will make them self-sufficient?
Lauren?
Great question. I think start where you live, start with your friends, start with your school. I visited a ton of school cafeterias around the country, and unfortunately many school cafeterias only have a deep fryer and a freezer. They don't even have the ability to serve fresh food. So if you can actually affect change at your own school and what your school is serving, and obviously there's constraints within the budget of the school and what they're able to buy, I would say that's an awesome place to start. And if you can affect your local community, but also I would say, you know, think globally, and there's a lot of ways because we are so interconnected. I just visited Honduras a month ago, and it was the first time all these little kids in this, you know, rural Honduran school said, I'm on Facebook, and they wrote down their names. So now we're friends on Facebook. So it's this very connected and very cool world where you can, you know, very quickly reach out and communicate with this, you know, amazing kids in Honduras or wherever who are every day living with the issue of hunger. So I think it's about being innovative and you know, looking around you and seeing what tools are at your fingertips, but just taking a stab at it and really just caring and getting involved, and don't get discouraged or give up. Just really, you know, I think you all have many more of the answers than we probably have.
Yeah, go ahead. We got one more question after we have.
I would echo what you said. A lot of the challenges that we see in food security are challenges we're seeing with environmental resources. So when you guys are taking showers or leaving lights on or turning lights off, when you're using electricity, when you're using cars, when you're using anything that uses a natural resource, I'd say also start focusing on the impact that residential use of those things has on the environment. I mean, one of the big things we see is a competition between agricultural and urban communities for water. So again, and there's a lot that I think each of us, whether you're a young person in school or whether you're, you know, whoever's the oldest person in the room, it doesn't really matter. There's a lot that we can each do ourselves that will make a significant impact when you pull it all together.
yeah, I was just going to say, you know, students are great at creating movements. You know, and back to the comment that the professor from Harvard School of Public Health, you know, my background is health and public health, and it has been amazing to see how HIV, for instance, was one of these issues that students got totally involved in, and, you know, got so, you know, there were clubs on every campus, and then it became a global health issue, and now everybody wants to go and do a rotation around global health. You can do the same thing around these issues, you know, and as Beth said, I think connecting the dots, because they're all interconnected. Agriculture is a health issue because nutrition is is foundational to health. It is an environmental issue. So I mean, you all are great at creating movements. Just go out and create one.
Okay, it's a good challenge. Okay, Lori, you're the last quick question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lori Tisch, and I run the New York City Green Cart Initiative. So actually I wanted to, if I could, just address the woman from Texas about the obesity issue. So what we've done, thanks to Mayor Bloomberg in New York City, is put over 500 green carts into the streets of New York in areas called food deserts, where there was little or no access to healthy food. So that, you know, is just one thing that, you know, we're a relatively small foundation, but just one small thing that people can do. There are now, I think, 8 or 10 cities around the country with their own green cart movements. So it's just one example of what the private sector can do. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, let me just make a couple final comments before we close. I just want to give you a quick anecdote. I was in Tanzania last year, and I met somebody with the government. Long story short, he says to me, he says, "You have 3 of the greatest leaders in the world in America." And I said, "Who is that?" They said, "It's Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush." And I said, "I couldn't find 10 people in America who would say that." And so I said, "Why?" They said, Bill Clinton, because of his commitment to AIDS and his work in Rwanda and Uganda and other places. Barack Obama, because of his continuation, Feed the Future, and also because of his background. And George W. Bush, because he saved more lives than probably any other president in the history of the country in terms of global AIDS and malaria, something he does not get very much credit for at all. The bottom line in this is we're known for our efforts to engage the world. It's good for us. 25% of all the members of the UN General Assembly are from Africa. This is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do for America to be engaged. And so I do think that it is something that it's rewarding for us. And the final point I would make, and excuse me for doing this, is, you know, you look at these fires in Colorado Springs and around here, and you think to yourself, what's happening around the world affects us too. These are not just issues for Africa. These are issues for the world. Drought, climate, growing enough food, hunger, nutrition. We are all in this together. And it's just not one remote corner of the world where my mother used to say, eat this green bean because pretending like you're a child in India without food. You know, this is worldwide, and it affects all of us. It is very important. I'm glad Aspen has recognized this by having this. And Peggy, thanks to you. And thanks to our panel for all their great help here, too.